Hello again, students. How's it going? Instructor Holland here, as always, with the VLP Network, coming to you with yet another Case Study Sunday. Like I say at the beginning of every single video, I hope all of my students are doing well. If I have any new students coming to me from other areas of the world, welcome to the channel. I hope you all learned something while you're here. First and foremost, before we get into the video, I just want to say I apologize for my appearance. I know I'm all cut up. Some of you are probably wondering why. What can I say? Guys, I am a combat sports athlete. I train every single day. And sometimes accidents happen in training as well as when you're competing. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast. You're going to get cut up, you're going to get bruised, and that's just the way it is. I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. In a way, I love my cuts and I love my scars and stuff like that because they show what kind of person I am and what I've been through, and I just enjoy it. So apologize for the scars and apologize for the cuts and stuff like that. You're probably going to see a lot worse later on as the videos go on. So Case Study Sunday number 3. Today's case study is going to be a little bit different than the previous case studies that we've gone over before on this channel. Whereas previous case studies have kind of hit on the more true crime, serial killer, graphic type of case studies, this particular one is going to be focusing on something much different in a completely different direction. The topic for today's case study is going to be focused more on natural disasters, specifically Hurricane Katrina, one of the most devastating hurricanes that ever hit the continental United States. Now, the reason that I'm deviating from previous case studies is because even though the human-to-human threats that exist in the world are absolutely things that we need to watch out for, Mother Nature is the one single thing on this planet that pretty much we are always at its mercy. And if we are not prepared for certain natural disasters like the COVID-19 pandemic that just occurred, whether it's in viral form or bacterial form, or if it's some sort of weather anomaly like a hurricane, tornado, or some sort of geological anomaly like a earthquake of some kind, if we're not prepared for those disasters, we're not truly a prepared human being. And preparation covers much more than just being prepared for human-to-human interaction. So with that being said, we're going to briefly go over the events of the hurricane. We're going to go over some of the devastation that it caused and some of the things that, in my personal opinion, are things that you need to do to avoid being victims of such a disaster. So if there's nothing for me, I have nothing for you. Have a seat and let class begin. So I'm sure everyone that is watching is old enough to remember Hurricane Katrina. I certainly do. It didn't happen a very long time ago. But just to clarify and to refresh what actually happened, let's go over some very basic facts. So Hurricane Katrina was a Category 5 hurricane that occurred in 2005. It affected multiple countries and multiple states in the United States and had over 1,500 casualties caused worldwide. Now, even though it affected a lot of areas of the United States, the one specific spot in the United States that we are going to focus on is New Orleans. And the reason that we're going to focus on New Orleans is because New Orleans is generally thought to be the area of the United States that received the most damage and the most amount of fatalities. The reason for this was because when the hurricane hit, the levees that were created across the city in order to manage the water flow into the city and stuff like that ended up failing, causing 80% of the city to be flooded. As a result of the flooding, pretty much every single mode of transportation with the exception of boats were rendered inoperative, and pretty much all primary and secondary roads leading in and out of the city were destroyed. All of these factors kind of combined to create a perfect storm that caused as many issues in New Orleans as it did. Because of all these factors happening, over 700 fatalities occurred in New Orleans alone. It is estimated that over 60,000 civilians were left stranded in the city for a very long period of time, sometimes ranging upwards of several weeks. The National Guard, the Red Cross, and the Coast Guard were all brought in to help with disaster relief, but because of the extensive damage, they were finding it incredibly difficult because the damage was so ridiculously widespread that at that point in time, until national levels of aid were brought in, they didn't have the resources and the manpower in that particular location to deal with all of it. And so for that reason, thousands of people found that they were stranded and left alone with really no supplies or anything else to aid them, and that help was not coming for a very particularly long period of time. Now, because primary and secondary roads and all other modes of transportation were basically destroyed, law enforcement and emergency medical services were having a ridiculously hard time really answering to any emergency calls. As always, when law enforcement and stuff like that are rendered inoperative, you end up having the criminals and you end up having the desperados that tend to stick to the shadows, eventually come out and take advantage of the situation. Looting and rioting ended up happening citywide, with packs of individuals going to local stores, kicking down the doors, breaking through the windows, and just stealing everything they could. Now, it should be noted that a lot of this looting was also caused by desperate people who had not prepared for the situation that they were now faced with and were grossly lacking in everything that they needed, from basic supplies like hygiene items and food and water to everything like clothing items. It was just a really, really, really bad time, and everyone was desperate for everything. However, once again, you have those criminals who take advantage of the situation, and while all this stuff was going on, multiple car thefts, rapes, and murders were reported. The city's convention center is actually one of those areas that had kind of a hot spot of these things. There were 4 deaths that were attributed to what could be considered homicide, although none of the cases have really been solved because, again, all the situations that were happening, it was kind of low on their priority list. Eventually, when people were rescued and brought over to areas that had been set up as disaster relief shelters and everything, there were so many people that needed things that the supplies ended up becoming dwindled, and families and individuals only received minuscule things that they needed. Eventually, national help ended up arriving and massive amounts of aid were received and the people were able to get what they needed, but in those first several weeks, it was pretty much desperation. As a matter of fact, I distinctly remember somebody that I talked to in my life that went through this whole thing when he was a kid, and that was this Marine that I ended up becoming relatively good friends with when I was going through Marine combat training down in Camp Geiger, North Carolina. He ended up telling me a whole bunch of really graphic stories. I won't share them here, but he told me really, really heartbreaking things like when he was a kid and stuff like that, and this whole thing happened. His parents only had cereal to feed him, and they had to put the cereal in a bowl, but they had no milk, obviously, because their electricity was out and stuff, and so he was forced to eat the cereal with water, but it didn't really matter because he was so hungry. He left that whole situation, he left that whole event feeling really, really, really out of it. A lot of the stuff he didn't even really want to talk about, but he talked about it to us because, again, we were in the Marine Corps together, we were considered his brothers and stuff like that, and he ended up opening up to us a lot about what happened, but he made it perfectly clear that the situation was so desperate that people were pretty much doing whatever they could to survive. And in a way, can you really blame them? I mean, outside of the criminals who utilized this situation as a perfect opportunity for them to do the horrible things that they wanted to do, can you really blame the people that were willing to go and kick down a grocery store door and steal stuff because their children were hungry? I mean, that's just desperation. That's just people wanting to take care of their loved ones and their families and their kids. So, I mean, when desperation calls, sometimes you have to do what you have to do. But once again, the whole point of being a prepared individual is that we hopefully don't have to reach that point before help eventually comes to us. And this is unfortunately something that you see a lot of whenever these large-scale disasters occur. Most of the population is not in any way, shape, or form prepared for it. And that is where the lessons that we learn from this horrendous disaster are going to come into play, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Now, when I was down in Los Angeles during the coronavirus pandemic, when it first started and everything like that, the amount of ridiculous behavior that I saw from the general public inside the grocery stores and stuff like that was insane. I'm sure all of you have seen the internet videos and the news videos of people panic buying all the different supplies and how all these grocery stores pretty much had empty shelves and stuff like that for several weeks on end before they could get restocked. And that's one of the primary things that we need to take away from not only the Hurricane Katrina disaster, but any sort of natural disaster whatsoever. It's a really, really, really bad idea to build your ark while the flood is occurring. If something happens and you desperately need supplies, it is a completely fundamentally incorrect idea to go out while the disaster is occurring and try and accrue supplies then, because you are going to be doing the same exact thing that all the other unprepared people are doing, and you're going to have severe demand and competition for those vital supplies. It is estimated that the average American family only have in their houses at any one given time about 1 week's worth of food and other supplies before their supplies completely run out and they need to go out into the town to restock. Why does this happen? Well, that's because most people don't want to spend money on things that we are not going to use. People often view stockpiling supplies as a waste of money because when am I ever going to use that? I have things that I need right this very minute. I need to make dinner for my 2 kids tonight. I have to make sure that we have food throughout the week. I have to make sure that I can put gas in my car. So we have this immediate effect mentality whenever it comes to buying things that we need. It's either things that we're going to use very, very soon or things that we're going to use right at that moment. But should a situation occur where you desperately need supplies and you don't have them, What are you going to do? You're going to go out and you're going to compete with everyone else for supplies? It's going to be a total shit show, and bad things could potentially happen. Human beings will do crazy things whenever they are desperate for survival, and that includes enacting violence on other human beings in order to get what they need to survive. If you are out inside of a grocery store and there's 100, 200 other people that are there desperately trying to get supplies for their kids, and you're not the only one that has kids, or you're not the only one that has family, you can imagine how quickly the situation can degrade into violence. It's for that reason that I highly recommend that every single American family should have, at bare minimum, 2 weeks of supplies stashed away inside the house at any one given time in case a disaster occurs. Now, 2 weeks is relative to the size of the family, so you're going to have to figure out just how much supplies you need based upon how many members of your family live inside your home. On average, and this is just going on average, a standard human being needs 2,000 calories a day for food in order to stay active. That means being able to go out and do certain things without suffering from extreme fatigue, as well as requiring at minimum 1 gallon of water per day in order to stay hydrated. Dehydration will kill you way faster than starvation will, so water should be your priority. Unfortunately, water is probably one of the things that people stock even less than food. These caloric and hydration numbers are also just the average. You have to take into account not only the amount of people you have in your home, but also the weather conditions and the activity levels of all of these people in your family. For example, yes, we require 1 gallon of water a day, but let's say you live down in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, for example, during the summertime, and it's 115 degrees out. You're going to require more than 1 gallon of water, and hopefully you have that amount. Now, also take into account that let's say it's you, your wife, and your 2 children, and they're also going to need more than 1 gallon of water per day. If services to the city are cut off and you don't have any running water, well, where are you going to get it? Hopefully you have enough stashed away at that point in time, so that way you can at least hold off until the services are turned back on, or emergency and disaster relief services can come get to you. Now, purchasing and storing water is much more complicated than just buying a bunch of bottled water cachets and putting them into your pantry. There are ways of properly storing water, and I'll briefly go over a few of them right now. Anytime you are going to store water, you want to make sure that the water is in a dark, cool place that is out of direct sunlight. Direct sunlight can cause algae to grow inside of water containers, and that can contaminate the water. At the same time, the type of plastic that you are using for the containers matters as well. If you have a plastic that is not rated for food or water, then contaminants and poisons can actually end up seeping into the water and can cause medical issues for you. Most containers that are designed to store water long term are colored blue, and that's because blue actually ends up inhibiting sunlight coming through the container better than other colors do. If you're going to store water in your garage, make sure that you don't do it on top of the cement, because the chemicals from the cement can actually end up seeping up underneath into the water source and again contaminating it. So it's a good idea to put either wood or cardboard underneath the water containers that you have, and then put a tarp over it so that way no sunlight can get to it. That's what I do, and I have my water stores stored inside of my garage. For food, you want to make sure again that you have at least 2 weeks of perishables, and by perishables I mean canned goods. As a matter of fact, the USDA themselves say that if stored in proper conditions, canned goods can actually be stored almost indefinitely. And the reason for that is because the process of canning is actually one of the most safe and sanitary ways of canning and storing food. The cans themselves have these very thin plastic liners on the insides that stop bacteria from coming in. The cans themselves are also heavily sanitized before use. And so when they can the food and stuff like that, especially the heat that goes into the whole canning process and everything, it's actually quite fascinating if you ever look it up. The way that it's stored, it stops bacteria from growing in most cases. One other thing I want to mention is shelf life dates, the best before dates that are on food. Those, as a matter of fact, do not actually mean when the food is going to go bad. What the best before date is actually referring to is the quality of the food, how good it's going to taste, the actual taste and quality of the food. It is always going to be best tasting before that date. But just because it's past that date does not mean that the food is going to be rotten or spoiled. Many foods are able to keep past their expiration date, and they're able to still be nutritious and have no medical side effects whatsoever. Another really good food source that can be accrued and hoarded are freeze-dried supplies, things like Mountain House and stuff like that. I highly recommend Mountain House. I ate them when I was in Afghanistan. They're delicious. Mountain House, if you need a sponsor, I mean, here I am. Just saying. But seriously, freeze-dried foods come in many different styles. Many different companies make them, and they're all very good. I highly recommend them. They keep for an incredibly long period of time, well over 10 years, and that is just the best before buy date. So if you store them in a cool, dry place, they're gonna store for a very long period of time. Military rations, things like MREs and stuff like that, can also be bought in stock, large amounts, in bulk. A website that I like to go to that I highly recommend is MRE Mountain. They have massive amounts of MREs, not just United States MREs, but MREs from all over the world. And if you ever want to try MREs from different militaries of the world, I highly recommend them. Now, one thing that we have to remember is that both freeze-dried foods and MREs tend to be more expensive. You tend to have to break the bank just a little bit more when you're trying to purchase them in large bulk quantities, whereas canned goods, super cheap. You can go to the dollar store like I did in my dollar store prep video, and you can pick up canned corn, canned peaches, canned fruits, canned beans for very, very, very cheap, and they store for a very long time. But regardless of what you buy, students, make sure the primary thing that you need to take away from this case study is always ensure that your house has, at the bare minimum, at least 2 weeks of supplies set aside in a separate room or somewhere else that you can easily get to that is not part of your main weekly food and water intake for yourself and your family. Make sure that you have at least 2 weeks of supplies set aside at all times, just in case. That way you don't have to go out when it's dangerous, when the situation is occurring, and risk life and injury to yourself or any other members of your family, either because the disaster is currently still ongoing or because, again, of the human factor, the people that are desperate, that are willing to do anything to get their hands on supplies. I know this is a very, very basic lesson to take away from this case study, but the basics are what is the most important thing, and if you don't have the basics, then the advanced stuff that comes later on is going to end up just crumbling down to the ground. It's the same with fighting. If you don't have a solid basis for your skills, then you're not going to be able to learn the advanced materials, because the advanced materials are based off of the foundation, the basics. So having a bare minimum of 2 weeks of food and water is a basic standard preparation lesson that we all need to understand and take away, and most citizens in the US or over the world don't do it. Now, I could get into all the other different supplies that we need to purchase, batteries, clothing, etc., but I'm just going to leave it right there for right now, because I can go over those things in different videos, and I want to keep this video relatively short. Because at the end of the day, a human being needs 3 specific things in order to continue living: food, water, and adequate shelter from the elements. And if we don't have those 3 primary things covered, all the other creature comforts that come afterwards aren't going to matter. So students, I hope you found this video educational. I hope it basically covered some of the fundamentals of survival prepping for your home and for your family, because once again, like I said before, at the end of the day, we need those 3 things: food, water, shelter from the elements. And if we don't have those things, none of the other things are going to matter. And it's those 3 things that most individuals find themselves lacking whenever they are presented with one of these man versus nature scenarios, and that's why they usually don't make it out, unfortunately. If you guys like me going over more survival-based preparation stuff, then I will do that in later videos. Just let me know. I can go more in depth, but I just wanted to hit the very basics on this particular video, because the basics are what failed a lot of people during Hurricane Katrina. As always, I hope everyone stays safe and stays prepared, because remember, victory loves preparation. I'll see you in the next video, guys. Class is dismissed. Have a good one.